Okay, so I did my master's research on clustering, collaboration. I spent a lot of time with cluster leaders around New Zealand, interviewing them, surveying their staff and finding out what the practices were that they used in their clusters. And I also, as part of my thesis, of course, did a literature review. And this is sort of explaining the purpose of collaboration. So those two key areas there are really important if you want to collaborate and make a difference for kids. So I'm talking about the type of collaboration that results in impact on student outcomes, okay? And these are two things that you need to be doing if you want to build those knowledge and skills in a cluster and improve. Now, there's inherent tension between building skills and knowledge and building relationships. So you can't have one without the other in a cluster, in a collaborative network. If you just build skills and knowledge on its own in a network, then sure, that will go some way to leading to change, but without building those relationships alongside, it's going to be really hard to get that change in your teaching staff and your leaders in any part of your cluster, any membership of your cluster. So it's really important to manage that tension. And sitting underneath all of these two categories, I guess, of the process are a whole bunch of practices, collaborative practices that you need to use to get there. So my key phrases that I use a lot, sounds a bit mean, sharing is nice but it's not enough. Now, I often say this, not to say stop sharing, because we all love sharing, but it's actually to, if you want to make that difference, like I was just saying, you've got to move on from some of these practices. Only things that you're doing in your network or your cluster, okay? So I actually think classroom visits, visiting each other's schools, getting ideas from each other can really inspire and energise people. And what we're doing at this conference as well at Ulearn, you know, you can get a lot of energy from that, and it can actually lead to change in practice if you do the right next things. So I'm definitely not saying don't share, but I'm just defining what collaboration is for you so that you can think about whether or not you're doing that. Okay, so from my research, from my study, and from working with clusters. And as I've started working with clusters more and more, it's definitely ringing true everywhere I go. So what can happen is one person who's got maybe a bit more energy than the others will start to take on informal leadership roles in the cluster. They'll start to do a lot of the admin, and they'll start to do a lot of the organising of meetings and even running sessions. And others start to resent them over time if there's no role clarity or agreement about who's doing what in the cluster. Okay, so you've got to watch out for these things, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you can watch out for them and do something about them. So this is a question I quite often ask networks when I'm working with them. Are you actually ready to critique yourselves? Because sometimes you're not, because that trust is broken down and you're unable to actually communicate and talk about things frankly. Sometimes when you're thinking about the goals, if you're a majority of primary and secondary, the ECE might not have a voice. So it's really important to address some of those elephants in the room and say, yep, we don't know what to do here. We might need to look at figuring out how do we get help to do that. Okay, so the first one that I had on that list earlier was focus on a common needs-based goal to learn and improve to get outcomes for kids. And I have a little set of do's and don'ts here, which I'll just quickly hand out to you. There might not be enough to go around because I think there's a few more people here than expected. So if you could just take one of those and pass it on, and spend a couple of minutes talking at your tables about those criteria and the do's and don'ts. And the idea here is that you look at those descriptors, which come out of the literature basically, out of the research, and you think about, do we do this or do we not do this? And then it's not about getting stuck into the detail of those and getting absorbed in them. It's about getting things rise to the top. So when you're talking in your cluster with whoever you decide to meet with about reviewing your collaborative practice, You can relax a bit about unpacking some of these descriptors because you can trust that what needs to rise to the top is a problem or an issue that you need to address will. And it also doesn't really matter if you focus on the do's column or the don'ts column first, or if you never get to the don'ts column, because what's in either column kind of balances off each other anyway. So I'll just give you 2 minutes to have a look at those and then have a little conversation amongst yourselves about what they might mean, and then we'll get back together. Ever, for example, but what sits underneath those goals is where the nuance comes in and the detail and the differences that can cater for everyone's needs as well. So it's about that lining up coherence. Did anyone want to, maybe I just take questions from out here about that handout that I provided? Anyone got any comments about that? Yes. Excellent. Not excellent. Cool. Okay, so what he's just saying there is that he finds it quite tough as inquiry, and I absolutely love using the spirals of inquiry resources with my clusters because we can then work through a process that I call a map inquiry as they go through this self-review. About what you're doing after you've done it. Reflecting on that and thinking what you'd do better next time. That's the beauty of spirals or cycles of inquiry. They're messy, and it's okay to not get it right the first, second, third and fourth time. It's just about improving on examples of being connected there, and I have put my blog and my Twitter handle there again for you, so you can check that out later if you need to. Now we have another slide here, which is, I've got a handout for this too that you can take away, but we won't have time to stop and talk about this one. This is the practices. There's those inquiring, using evidence practices that you need to use or not use if you want to facilitate that change and improvement in your cluster. And one of the things that, have I talked about tunnel vision yet? Tunnel vision on teachers? Okay, so one of the things here that I often talk about is change and improvement is not just about teachers. Often when I work with cluster leaders, they have tunnel vision on their teachers changing and improving. And yes, we know teachers have a huge impact on student outcomes and that they're very important and their practice is important. But if you get tunnel vision on your teachers, what I see is that the amount of pressure that gets loaded onto teachers in terms of whose job it is to achieve the cluster goals. So it's really important to spread that responsibility and accountability for reaching cluster goals to kids, families, communities, the leaders. Everyone should be answerable to each other for reaching those goals, okay? So watch out for tunnel vision. So there are some do's here: ensuring focused teacher learning, using evidence during teaching and learning, so again all that inquiry stuff, ensuring that teacher practice is referenced to impact on students. So you can hear all of that stuff from Teaching as Inquiry in here. Don't assume that change leads to improvement, so that's about checking in the cycle. Don't set goals without involving teachers, kids and communities, okay? So it's all these things I've already mentioned. That's what we mean by inquiring using evidence. One of the things that I love doing with clusters is mapping. And what I've been doing with a few clusters is when we realise we've got to step back and relook at the evidence and get more perspectives than those in the room, we go through an exercise where each principal draws their ecosystem. So they draw what's happening in their school and in their community and all the programs that are happening in school and all the different things they've got to juggle and keep up with. And just by imaging that, they come up with quite a shocking picture that makes them realise just how much is going on in their schools. And then I encourage them to share that with their other principals in the cluster, so I pair them up to share their maps. And that's a really lovely way to build that relational trust I've been talking about. So actually sometimes at cluster level at those leadership meetings, they're not talking about what's going on in each of their schools at that level of detail. So it's a real eye-opener to learn about each other's schools by going through that process. And once they've been through that mapping process with me, I ask them to go back out into their communities and do that with some kids, with some teachers, and with iwi, any other people whose perspectives they think are relevant to this cluster work. Okay, and that's how we start to build, or not build, but take the evidence that's already there, including those strengths that we were talking about earlier, and we start to figure out what it is we're going to do next. So I love doing that, and it comes from, there's a website there that you'll get in the slides and in the notes. And I've just learnt about this particular person, so I need to look up her name. I think her name's Patty Dabrowski. And she has presented about how you can use images to free up space in your mind to come up with ideas. And Steve Johnson has a really neat YouTube video that you can Google, and he talks about where good ideas come from. And that's a brilliant little video explaining and also demonstrating how when people talk like I'm doing right now, it's harder to process than if I was actually drawing pictures alongside it. You can process images thousands of times faster than you can process words. So when you're processing images, there's space in your brain to come up with those new good ideas, okay? So I really encourage you to think about that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to whiz you through in the last few minutes the rest of those criteria, for which there is a rubric like you've got there, not a rubric, but some do's and don'ts, that I'll be blogging over the next sort of 6 months or so and sharing some thinking around that. So use practices that challenge, really important to learn how to do that as well. It's the learning talk again. There's a couple of other references there. There's a great old teacher talk article in a set from many years ago that's still really awesome for teachers who want to learn how to challenge each other and critique each other's practice and do that using good language. And I've definitely used learning talk and it's brilliant. Timperley Wilson and Barara Fung, that's the yellow BESS, the Teacher Professional Learning and Development BESS, they talk about the importance of external expertise. So actually bringing someone in to help to do that and to guide you into the next stages of using practices that challenge. Revisit your purpose regularly, so don't become stagnant. I'm not sexist. That could easily be the other way around in my opinion. So you could definitely be a woman sitting there trying to understand men with a glass of wine and a skeleton figure. So revisiting purpose regularly is really important. It's really important to go through those cycles and come back round and check your collaborative practice again. And that's that big macro inquiry I'm talking about again, so it's over a longer period of time. So while your leadership group or whoever you have at that macro level thinking about cluster goals up here is meeting over time, they'll be going through this long, slow inquiry while your teachers going through these smaller cycles of inquiry here for their children, and that evidence is feeding up. Okay. Ensure role clarity and build relational trust. So those two go hand in hand because of what I explained earlier. If you don't have that role clarity, the trust breaks down. People start to misunderstand each other and don't really get where each other are coming from without knowing what their roles are to achieve those goals. So it's about reducing that vulnerability. And I quite often use Lencioni's work, which is, he calls this the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And he says that trust is that bottom part of the triangle there, the pyramid, and it's the bottom because it needs to come first. And he also says that building trust requires vulnerability, so that means you have to be able to say, I don't know, I'm sorry I got that wrong, all those sorts of things. There's also a really neat video of him talking about this on YouTube, and you can Google that as well, Patrick Lencioni. It's quite an old video, but it's really useful. And then if you can build that trust, you can move into a space of healthy conflict, which is the next level up. If you don't, then you have a fear of conflict, and that's when those elephants in the room happen. And then you can move into the total commitment to the goals. And then you can move into taking accountability that requires that commitment. So that's that roles and accountability stuff again. It takes a while to work through all this stuff, especially if you're having to backtrack because you've been together for a long time. You have to undo old habits. And then, of course, that leads to those results or not. Okay, so this is just a couple of examples, which I'm really going to whiz through now, of two clusters I'm working with. This is an example one from going through that process I've kind of very high speed described. This is what they came up with as their next steps. And you can see, you know, they're looking to refine their goals, start to build that role clarity and accountability. They actually need to develop a proper vision and goals and plan based on needs of everyone. So it's about including all of the schools and services. And then they've got to get on to planning and building coherence. Example 2. If you look at that, however, the two clusters are incredibly different. So this cluster, for example, they are a new cluster, have just started working together. Awesome relationships between the principals in the cluster. Very little involvement from the rest of the members of the cluster, and I'm going like this because it's those teachers and the other people back in the communities and schools. So that's what they've got to work on. Even though they've got a similar order of things, it's what sits in between those things that's important to think about. Whereas this cluster have been going together for over 10 years, and lack of role clarity and accountability has led to a lack of trust. And so they're really strongly focused on building trust through their sessions as they work through these next steps. Okay, I think that's it. So thanks for listening to me. I'm sorry that's so short, but that's what a taster session is, so I hope you got something out of it. And I'll bring around these handouts now as well. So kia ora koutou.